Not on my watch. How was I going to keep these kids from falling through the cracks? I was baffled by 4 students who failed almost every test. So over the lunch table, I asked my colleague for advice, and her matter-of-fact response was, some of them just aren't going to make it. And while I said nothing, inside I screamed, not on my watch, not in my classroom. Are you frustrated by an education system that seems to have written your child off? Is it painful to watch someone you love struggle? Were you one of the ones written off as just not going to make it? Some of them just aren't going to make it was not an acceptable option to me. And I suspect it isn't for you either, especially not when it's your child or someone you love. I was so disappointed by the bureaucratic constraints of the school system that I felt left my hands tied to get the kids the help they so desperately needed. How many of you struggle with learning in some way in school? How many of you have a child who has dyslexia or other reading challenge? How many of you have dyslexia yourself? According to the International Dyslexia Association, between 15 to 20% of the population has dyslexia. That is roughly 1 in 6 individuals who have dyslexia's uniquely wonderful brain wiring. And I trust that you will also embrace this more Flipside strengths perspective that is far more empowering. I believe that these individuals are not broken. Their brains are just wired for a different kind of excellence. They may just not learn well the way things are typically taught in most schools. And my colleagues' comment that some of them just aren't going to make it confirmed for me that I did not belong in a traditional classroom. So I shifted to tutoring. And I learned through trial and error and many specialized trainings, including Orton Gillingham, Davis, NILD, and others, what worked for students facing a variety of learning challenges. And as I grew to care about the individual kids I was working with, my passion for the struggling learner grew. And my focus shifted to empowering students with dyslexia. One mom expressed frustration that her 9-year-old daughter was ashamed because her 6-year-old brother was catching on to reading faster than she was. And while she was making progress in her tutoring, there was just so much I could do in the 2 hours a week I got to work with her. She was struggling to stay afloat in school, really just trying to keep her head above water and slipping further and further behind. I had known since I wrote my philosophy of education in my first school of education class that I was going to need to design my own school someday in order to personalize learning the way I believed it was needed. So in 2003, when a few of the homeschooling clients I was working with asked me to provide more structure for their children's education, I decided it was time to start the school I had been called to create. For 8 years, I served 3 to 13 struggling middle school and high school students in a very homeschool style setting, building the foundation for my personalized approach to learning. By 2011, I had parents in over a dozen cities as I spoke and consulted at homeschool conventions around the country saying, "Oh, I wish your school were here," when they heard about my personalized approach to learning. So I decided that my gifts and passion for empowering students with dyslexia and other outside-the-box learners would serve a wider audience if I closed the physical school and shifted online. In 2020, I felt for all the teachers who were thrust into crisis schooling as their schools were struggling to adapt to teaching online on such short notice. I knew the hundreds of hours of curriculum research that I had done during our 2-year small-scale pilot when we were shifting online. So while many students were losing ground when schools went online, many of our students were making 2 to 3 years skills gains, since we had long since figured out how to personalize learning online to meet each student where they're at. And while I would never wish the pandemic on the world, one of the benefits it brought was greater awareness to parents of how their kids were struggling. And once their eyes were opened to how their kids really weren't doing well with traditional school, even once the world opened back up, many parents are looking for educational alternatives where their kids can be met where they are and thrive. And many others are looking to fill the skill gaps that were created or exacerbated by the sudden shift to pandemic crisis schooling. And despite what you may have heard in the media, some students actually do much better with online school. I believe that if a child can't learn well the way we teach, we need to find alternate ways to teach the way they learn. So I invite you to picture with me an alternate approach to education. What if, instead of expecting every child to be ready for a particular set of skills at the same time, in a supposedly one-size-fits-all grade-level package, we meet each student where they are in each skill area? What if we maximize the effectiveness of teacher time by using quality, online, adaptive learning programs developed against a solid set of academic standards to identify which skills each individual student needs extra support in and provide the practice needed between instruction? What if we multiply the number of students we can meet right where they are by grouping kids across the school or even across the district for targeted skill instruction? What if we allow each student to work at their own pace, as slow as they need for mastery, yet as fast as they're ready? And we move students along based on when they've mastered the skills, not because the curriculum says we're all supposed to be on page 103 today. What if we focus on the skills that are actually important in today's world, such as discerning which information is relevant and application to life, rather than being able to spit back answers on a test? What if we empower all students to embrace their strengths while we help them shore up their weaknesses? What if we take a student-centered approach where the child's needs are at the center? The curriculum serves as a tool and a guide, not the taskmaster. What if we focus on whole person well-being? And the child's academics are one part of their broader life. I believe that every student deserves a holistic, personalized education that addresses their Flipside strengths and their challenges. No child should be written off as just not going to make it. And I know it's possible, because for the past 13 years, my growing team and I have used these principles to personalize education for over 1,000 students with dyslexia and other outside-the-box learners in over 40 states and 15 foreign countries. I am so glad that I listened to the call to shift from my tiny brick-and-mortar school to online, long before online schooling was common, so that I could be a part of these many paths to success stories. I now want to offer a Flipside strengths perspective that will have you looking at individuals who learn differently than the way the traditional school is set up in a more empowering light. Now, we all have these continuums within us of how our brains approach the world. Many of us are somewhere in the middle, neither particularly strong nor particularly weak in any given skill. However, we do tend to lean one way or the other as to which come easier and which are more challenging. And it makes sense that those with exceptional strengths along one end would have greater struggle with the flip side associated skills. And since my expertise is in dyslexia, I'm going to offer 4 examples of the ways that the brains of individuals with dyslexia are wired for different kinds of excellence. And I invite you to consider where you fall along each of these continuum as well. Our first continuum involves the left and the right sides of the brain. This image shows in blue the white matter pathways of a brain of a man with dyslexia, overlaid over the pathways of a person with more typical brain architecture shown in gold. Many aspects of language are strongly clustered in the left hemisphere of the brain of a more neurotypical learner. And while this man with dyslexia has less well-developed left brain connections, his right brain connections are far more extensive than his non-dyslexic counterpart. Dr. Manuel Casanova's study found that dyslexics tend to have more widely spaced mini-columns in the outer cortex layer of their brain, with longer axon connections between them. These connections between different parts of the brain contribute to some of the incredible strengths of dyslexia, which allows them to make connections between pieces of information that many others miss. But it does have them using more parts of their brain for tasks associated with language, and it makes that part of learning less efficient. However, many individuals with dyslexia typically have strengths in the right hemisphere, as well as this cross-hemisphere processing strength. The right hemisphere of the brain controls holistic thinking that is more based on intuition, feelings, and nonverbal aspects. It is the part that works on associations, analogies, and making connections between ideas and big picture thinking. It is the part where imagination, creativity, and daydreaming thrive. And the more visual spatial aspects that include art, as well as rhythm and music, are also strengths of the right hemisphere. In contrast, the left hemisphere of the brain, that many individuals with dyslexia tend to be weaker in, is associated with objective, logical, linear, sequential, analytic, and strategic thinking. It is the part that works in a step-by-step, systematic manner and focuses on parts and details. It deals with the symbolic thinking involved in using numbers and letters that represent math and language. It also deals with facts and our sense of time. Our next continuum involves 2D verbal sequential versus 3D visual spatial. For a dyslexic brain that is wired for excellence in those 3D visual spatial skills, the skills so highly valued by our education system, reading, spelling, writing, and math, they rely on two-dimensional symbols that can only be viewed from one angle, typically work in a left to right linear sequential manner, cause a great deal of frustration. However, the ranks of professionals in the fix-it, make-it, build-it type careers are filled with skilled dyslexics, including actor Tom Cruise, architect Richard Rogers, basketball player Magic Johnson, chef Jamie Oliver, director Steven Spielberg, fashion designer Tommy Hilfiger, and inventor Henry Ford. Our next continuum involves struggles with fine details and discrete information versus strengths with big picture and contextual learning. I believe that most students benefit from a more narrative approach to education, where we weave the information we want them to learn into the context of stories, case studies, illustrations, documentaries, historical fiction, role plays, simulations, and application to topics of personal interest. For individuals with dyslexia and others with big picture and contextual learning strengths, this approach can provide hooks to anchor the fine details of discrete information into a broader context. 9 out of 10 dyslexics describe their thinking as seeing past the detail to gain a strategic, big picture view of a subject or a problem. This allows them to see patterns and trends in data. And our final continuum involves difficulties with procedural and rote learning versus intuitive reasoning strengths. According to the Dyslexic Advantage, half of individuals with dyslexia have difficulty with step-by-step procedural learning, such as involved in learning long multiplication. It is so important that we help these students not give up on themselves, especially in the early grades when there's such emphasis on this procedural learning and rote memorization, like learning math facts and sight words. Because in the older grades, in the real world, there's a much greater value placed on the cross-thinking, the connections, the analogies, and the inferences that individuals with dyslexia tend to be skilled in. And many individuals with dyslexia have an intuitive reasoning and learning approach that allows them to examine situations from multiple perspectives and come to rich conclusions. However, they may not be able to explain how they came to that solution. 84% of dyslexics are above average in reasoning. And both NASA and the British Intelligence Agency actively recruit individuals with dyslexia for their strong reasoning and problem-solving skills. And 35% of US successful entrepreneurs have dyslexia's unique brain wiring, including Cher, Oprah, Steve Jobs, and Walt Disney. And 4 out of 5 people with dyslexia attribute their success to their dyslexic thinking. And that includes Charles Schwab, Jay Leno, Richard Branson, and Whoopi Goldberg. I find that this perspective of looking at dyslexia as a collection of Flipside strengths that are directly connected to the associated weaknesses to be far more empowering than a more typical deficit approach. Yes, individuals with dyslexia have some skills that need direct, systematic, explicit, and multisensory instruction to support their learning. And these are directly connected to common Flipside strengths of dyslexia. So whether you, your child, or someone else you love or interact with has dyslexia or is an otherwise outside-the-box thinker, I encourage you to affirm and celebrate the Flipside strengths that are directly connected to the challenges. Because I believe that individuals with dyslexia and other outside-the-box thinkers who are able to embrace these Flipside strengths and use their creative outside-the-box thinking are born to be world changers. And I believe that the kind of shift that we have made to a whole person personalized approach to education is one that could change our paradigm of education from a one-size-fits-all, but really fits no one model, to one that meets each student for who they are. Let's not settle for putting kids into a canned curriculum box that isn't a good fit. Don't you think that every child deserves a personalized education? Thank you.